morning. We're going to talk about watercolor today. It's one of my very favorite subjects and certainly my favorite form of painting for me personally. Let's start off talking about supplies. Let's talk about what you absolutely need and what you could get away with substituting. I always do a drawing first of every watercolor that I do. So I highly recommend a pencil. You want something that has a soft enough lead that it won't create crevices in the paper, but also something light enough that it won't be distracting in your final painting. So pencil, absolute must, eraser. Let's get into the specifics of watercolor. You will definitely need watercolor paper. That's a very difficult one to substitute. I prefer to use cold press rough paper, something that's got a little bit of tooth or roughness to the paper, holds the water and the pigment very nicely. The reason that you need watercolor paper as opposed to any other kind of paper is that watercolor paper is made specifically to hold water and pigment without it bleeding everywhere or wrinkling up. I've had some problems recently with some watercolor paper that has lost its sizing. Sizing is kind of like the glue that's used to keep the pigment and the water from running and bleeding everywhere. So if you have unsized paper or paper that's lost its sizing, it's kind of like painting on a paper towel. You put your paintbrush down and the water and the paint just bleed everywhere. Very frustrating. So find some watercolor paper. The heavier the weight, the better. I pretty much don't use anything below 300 grams. Watercolor paper. The next thing that you will need will be a brush. So I've got my brushes here. Watercolor brushes are most often a natural haired brush or natural furred brush. I'm not sure what you would call it. Anyway, natural fibers. And this is because the natural fibers will hold the water. You absolutely have to have a brush that holds plenty of water. It's called watercolor for a reason. There's lots of water involved. It's a very wet kind of painting. So you want a brush that will be able to hold lots of water. At the moment, this is my favorite brush. This is actually a Chinese calligraphy brush, and you may be able to see that it's got quite a bit of a fluffy brush tip here when it is dry. However, when it's dipped into the water, it comes into this very nice point. This is a great brush because it holds tons of water. You can paint anything from big, fat, beautiful brush strokes to teeny tiny little baby brush strokes. Love this brush. This is actually my daughter's brush, but you can see where it lives. So there's a couple of other brushes that I always have on hand. A nice wide flat brush. These are good for large areas. Sometimes you just end up painting a lot of water onto your paper. These are great for that. And then the other thing that is nice to always have on hand is a small detail brush. Depending on the painting, but mostly I use these at the end to tidy up things and make all the edges nice and crisp. Okay. So brushes, find something that holds a lot of water, preferably natural fiber. And then because watercolor is so wet and so much water is involved, and you're always working on controlling the amount of water on your brush and the amount of water on your paper, you want to have a nice cotton rag. I say cotton because you'll want your rag to be very absorbent, and just like the brush, natural fibers, they absorb the water. So nice rag. You will want something to hold your paints on. I think this might be a candy mold. I'm not sure. It's little pumpkins. Anything that will hold paint will do. Look around, see what you got in the cupboard. Doesn't matter. Just something that will hold paint and a bit of water. A palette. And then you'll need paint. And this is a point of a lot of discussion. There's no need to rush out and buy watercolor paints. Any paint suspended in water will be just fine. So if you have acrylic paints on hand, give them a go. All you need to do is water those babies down. The act of watercolor painting is using pigment suspended in water. So that pigment may be bound with gum arabic, like in traditional watercolors, or it may be bound with acrylic, like in acrylic paint. It's not important. What is important is that whatever paint you use, you are keeping it nice and transparent. So the thing that gives watercolor its beauty is adding layers upon layers of transparent paint and building these layers up in a way so that you can see the depth of the layers as you look at the final painting. I'm going to be using acrylic inks. I really, really love acrylic inks, but again, don't go out and buy anything until you've tried the watercolor technique and you know that it's something you want to do. Then you can spend money on inks or a really nice set of watercolors. But practice first before you begin. The reason that just a little plug for inks after I said don't go buy them. The thing that I love about the inks is they are very vibrant, and they hold that vibrancy even once they're dry. Okay. A couple of other things that I always have on hand. One is a reference picture. You may or may not want to use a reference picture. That just depends on your own personal style. The thing that I've been doing recently is having the reference picture on my phone. And I will have the color version of the picture, and then I will also have a black and white version of the picture. This helps because as you're painting, sometimes you look at your painting and you're like, this is a little bit flat. And having a picture that is in black and white can show you where, oh yeah, that's where I need to get a lot darker. So again, that's just personal preference. Okay, let's get started. Let's paint. Okay, so first things first. Draw. Do a drawing. Make a sketch. Do a drawing. Use pencil. Go light, very light, as light as you possibly can. But definitely start off with a drawing. Okay. So once you have your drawing finished, I prepared mine yesterday, so it's already done. You can start thinking about your color palette. Get that out of the way. Now, oftentimes what I like to do is just put my color palette on the back side of my painting because it doesn't get lost and it's always with the painting. However, for the purposes of this video, I'll be doing my color palette on the back of a painting I've decided I don't really care about. So I prefer to work with a very tight color palette. I choose colors based on not only what I see in the picture, but I will always pick something to be a shadow color. I prefer to use color instead of black to create shadows. I often use purple or a combination of purple and blue to create shadows. And then I will also pick a highlight color. And that is usually, but not always, red or some sort of, or not red. It's usually, but not always, yellow, or a yellowy orange color. So when I buy paint, I typically just buy primary colors, and I like to mix all of my own colors. For painting of this size especially, it's really important to keep track of the colors you've mixed so that you can remix them as they go along. I prefer to keep a very tight and controlled palette. When you begin to think about your color palette, think about the colors you'll need for shadows, for highlights, and for the colors you need for whatever it is that you're painting. You'll want to keep very careful notes about the colors that you've mixed together and the ratios that you've used. You may also want to consider what each of the colors looks like overlaid with other colors. This is a good time to work that out now. When I begin a painting, I paint from dark to light. I start in the very darkest areas of my painting and I slowly build paint up. Now, with traditional watercolor paint, if you go in too heavy in the beginning and you have lots and lots of pigment on your paper, every time you go over that area, you will pick pigment up and move it around the paper. This can lead to a very muddy looking watercolor. So part of the reason that I do this dark to light painting is because I started painting with traditional watercolor paints, and so my technique has kind of evolved around that. With acrylic paints, or with acrylic inks, you don't have to worry about that, or with acrylic paint, because once the paint dries, it will no longer move anywhere on the paper. When it's dry, it stays put. Watercolor, if it dries, it can still be picked up and moved around if you have heavy pigment and lots of water. So just keep that in mind. The other reason that I paint from dark to light is because in watercolor, the only places that will remain very light or without color are the places that you never put color. So you always have to be considering, where are my whitest whites going to be? Where are my highlights going to be? And you don't want to put any paint there. So if you start in the shadows, slowly work your way out, you're safe. You get lots of beautiful layers of color without having to worry about covering up your whites and without having to worry about putting too much pigment on the paper too quickly. In between each layer of watercolor, you must stop and take a break and let the paint dry. Well, now what this means is you literally have to stop. It's a good time to change your water, a good time to get up, stretch your legs, do the dishes, cook dinner, fold the laundry, anything that will keep you occupied for, a few minutes.
before coming back to your work. Your paper must be fully dry before you begin your next layer. So I literally take my hand and put it on the paper to see if the paper is cool. If the paper is still cool, I know that the water is still evaporating and it's not completely dry. If you don't wait until the paper is completely dry, your colors will bleed into each other. So stop and let your paper dry. Now, with a nice wet brush, I'm going to paint water onto the paper. So remember, pigment follows water. And we can use this information and create beautiful color washes across a wet area. So I've added water everywhere that I wouldn't mind the pigment traveling to. And then I've added a little bit of pigment onto the paper, and you can see it begin spreading across the wet area. So pigment follows water, and we can use this when we're waiting for our paint to dry and we don't want the pigment following the water. And we can use it when we're creating beautiful organic washes across the paper, where we just kind of wet the paper and let the pigment do what it would like. I am now about 4 or 5 layers into this painting, and you can see that it's still very, very light. So I'm really working very slowly to build up the darkest areas and working up, up, up towards the light. Remember, between each layer, stop and let the paint dry. The other thing that's really important to do, and maybe I haven't stressed enough, is to change your water. All that pigment that you're rinsing off your brush is ending up coloring your water. And if you don't have clean water, you're going to be putting that dirty water and the muddy pigment onto your paper. So try to make a habit of each time you stop to take a break to let your paint dry, to also go ahead and change your water. There will come a time in your painting where you've painted all the shadows to a point of satisfaction, and you're ready to begin painting the object's actual color. Now, unfortunately, in this sample, the flower is blue and the shadows are blue, but my process would have been the same up until this point, regardless of what the flower color in the end would look like. So if I'd been painting a red flower, everything would look exactly the same up until this point. And it's at this point that I'm going to be adding the color that the viewer sees the flower as. So in this case, just more blue. At this point, it's really important not to get overzealous and remember to leave white spaces. As I get closer to finishing this painting, my focus is going to be on cleaning up things using the very small brush. So I'm going to be working on making sure all of my edges are crisp where I would like them to be crisp. I'm going to be hanging the painting on the wall and stepping back from it and spending some time looking at it to make sure I like what I see. Another little trick that I have started doing recently that's really been beneficial is I will take a picture on my phone and then I will edit the picture so that the saturation of the color is 0. So I'm turning it into a black and white picture, and this black and white picture will let me know how my balance is between my lightest lights and my darkest darks, and I can decide if there are areas that I would like to go darker, and I can also decide if I've left maybe a little bit too much light areas. So the phone turns out to be a really handy watercolor tool. As you head into the final stretch of your painting, it's more important than ever to remember to let things dry. I find that sometimes by this point I'm starting to get really excited about things, excited to see what it's like when it's finished, and maybe a little bit impatient about continually waiting for things to dry. But trust me, just keep on waiting. And honestly, at this point in any painting, I will have a few places where pigment has bled into areas that I didn't really intend for it to be. You just got to go with it. It's part of watercolor. It's part of the nature of a watercolor painting. And in the end, you just have to make that work for you and not be so worried about everything being absolutely controlled. Let's review some of the things that we've talked about. Always remember to leave white spaces. Work from light to dark. Start in the shadows and work up. Don't forget to stop and let your painting dry between each layer. Let it dry, let it dry, let it dry. Remember, pigment follows water. You can use this to your advantage and not paint on top of a wet spot. And you can also create beautiful organic washes. Remember to change your water often so you're not creating a dirty painting. Use a small brush for details and nice crisp edges. You can use your camera to take a picture and use the black and white function to make sure you have enough lights and darks in your painting. And yes, really, let it dry.